A millionaire left his wife for a younger woman, but her next move stunned him. The sound of clinking glasses filled the air of Daniel Weston's penthouse, a sleek, sprawling space overlooking the city's skyline. The night sparkled, not just from the champagne in his hand, but from the aura of victory he basked in. He leaned back on the plush leather couch, savoring the golden liquid as it slid down his throat. He wasn't just celebrating a successful business deal that had made headlines earlier that morning. No, this was more personal. The papers were signed. His divorce from Rachel Weston was finalized, and he was officially free. Freedom had a taste, he thought, swirling the last sip of champagne. It tasted like control, like power, like Vanessa's cherry-red lipstick on his neck. Rachel had been a good wife, he mused, but good wasn't enough for a man like him. She'd been reliable, devoted even, but over time, she'd faded into the background of his life, a dull companion to his ever-evolving desires. Vanessa, on the other hand, was everything that Rachel wasn't. Spontaneous, young, effortlessly glamorous. She had breathed life back into his ego, made him feel invincible again. Daniel smirked to himself, remembering how Rachel had tried to maintain her composure during their final meeting with the lawyers. She hadn't cried, hadn't begged him to reconsider, though her hands trembled slightly as she signed her name on the papers. He had admired her pride, even as he dismissed it. When the final signature was made, she had looked him in the eye, her voice steady but tinged with something he hadn't recognized at the time. "I hope you know what you're doing, Daniel," she had said. He had laughed it off then, but now, as he poured himself another glass, he found himself replaying those words in his mind. What could she possibly mean? He had everything: money, youth at his side, and a life of luxury that most people only dreamed of. Rachel was the one walking away with the scraps of a life they had built together. Rachel, alone. He pictured her in a cramped apartment, sitting by herself with nothing but memories and regrets. The image pleased him. Maybe this was the fresh start she needed too, a chance for her to find herself, or whatever people said when their lives crumbled. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit apartment across town, Rachel Weston sat on a worn-out couch surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The air smelled of cardboard and faintly of rain from the storm earlier that evening. Emma, her 12-year-old daughter, had already gone to bed, her soft breathing audible from the small room down the hall. The apartment was a far cry from the sprawling mansion they had left behind, a place where Rachel had once entertained guests, raised her child, and built the life she thought would last forever. She pulled a thick blanket over her legs and stared at the flickering light of the TV, though she wasn't watching it. A bowl of uneaten soup sat on the coffee table, the spoon abandoned. It had been hours since her appetite left her. The divorce settlement had been cruel. She had gotten enough to live modestly for a while, but Daniel had fought her on everything else. The house, the investments, even the vacation home she had lovingly decorated. He had spared no mercy. The same man who once held her in his arms had stripped her of nearly everything. Yet, it wasn't the loss of luxury that gnawed at her. It was the humiliation, the feeling of being discarded. She could still hear Daniel's parting words ringing in her ears. "You'll see how much you needed me." They weren't just words. They were a taunt, a promise that he expected her to fail. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. She had cried enough in the weeks leading up to this moment. Now, there was only room for resolve. Emma's bedroom door creaked open, and the small footsteps padded across the hardwood floor until Rachel felt the gentle weight of her daughter settling next to her on the couch. "Mom?" Emma's voice was soft, filled with the kind of innocence that could break Rachel's heart. "Are you okay?" Rachel forced a smile and stroked her daughter's hair. "Of course, sweetheart. Just thinking." Emma leaned her head on Rachel's shoulder, her presence a warm reminder of why Rachel couldn't afford to crumble. Emma needed stability, not a mother lost in grief over a failed marriage. "Are we gonna be okay here?" Emma whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. Rachel took a deep breath, letting her daughter's question ground her. "Yes, we are. It's going to be different, but we'll be okay. I promise." The words felt fragile as they left her lips, but she clung to them like a lifeline. She would make it true, even if she didn't fully believe it yet. The next morning, Rachel woke before dawn, the weight of the day pressing down on her as soon as her eyes opened. Bills were due, and the job search had been nothing but dead ends. She had applied to over a dozen positions, but her time away from the workforce as a stay-at-home mother seemed to be working against her. Employers didn't see her sacrifices as valuable. They saw her as a risk. She brewed a pot of coffee, the smell temporarily lifting her spirits, and sat down with her laptop at the small kitchen table. Emma's school uniform hung neatly over a chair, and the sound of the neighborhood waking up hummed through the walls. She scrolled through job listings, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the keyboard. An hour later, the rejection emails started flooding in. Each one was like a punch to the gut. She closed the laptop and stared at the empty coffee cup in front of her. She couldn't let Emma see her like this. Not defeated, not questioning her worth. Her mind drifted back to the early years of her life, long before Daniel, when she had been a promising business graduate with dreams of starting her own company. She could almost hear the voice of her younger self. "You had dreams once. What happened to them?" The knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a delivery man holding a large envelope. She signed for it and opened it quickly, her heart racing. Inside was the final confirmation of her divorce settlement. The words felt cold, sterile, just like the process had been. Attached was a note from Daniel's lawyer, polite but curt, as if her life had been reduced to paperwork. Rachel clenched the papers in her hand and closed her eyes. She wouldn't let Daniel have the satisfaction of being right. She had no idea how, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. An old friend, Peter, answered after the second ring. His familiar voice instantly soothed her nerves. "Rachel, it's been so long. I need your help," she said, her voice steady. And with that, the wheels of her new journey began to turn. Before we continue, here's something to think about. If you were in Rachel's shoes, starting over with almost nothing, what would be your first step? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Rachel's modest apartment, casting streaks of gold on the kitchen floor. It wasn't the soft, luxurious lighting she was used to in the mansion where the sunlight danced across marble countertops and stainless steel appliances. Here, it was simple and raw, just like her life had become. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but it did little to comfort Rachel as she stared down at the blinking cursor on her laptop. She scrolled past job listings for positions she was either overqualified for or woefully underqualified to even consider. Administrative assistant, receptionist, part-time cashier. Nothing seemed to fit the life she used to lead. With a sigh, she minimized the job board and opened the stack of bills waiting to be dealt with. The electric bill was due in 2 days, and the rent wasn't far behind. Her savings, what little she had left after the divorce, was depleting fast. She rubbed her temples, feeling the pressure mount, and closed her eyes briefly to block out the reality staring back at her. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her hair tousled from sleep and her pajama sleeves slipping down over her hands. "Morning, Mom," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. Rachel smiled, though it was forced. "Good morning, sweetheart. Hungry?" Emma shrugged and slid into a chair at the table, propping her head on her hands. "I guess. Can I have cereal?" "Sure thing." Rachel opened the cupboard and pulled down the box of cereal, pouring it into a bowl and adding milk. As she placed it in front of Emma, she couldn't help but notice the familiar furrow of worry on her daughter's brow. Emma had always been perceptive, far beyond her years. It was a blessing and a curse. "Are you okay, Mom?" Emma asked between bites. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine, honey. Just a lot on my mind. Is it about money?" Emma's voice was quiet, but it cut through Rachel like a blade. Swallowing her pride, Rachel sat down across from her daughter. "A little bit, but it's nothing you need to worry about. I'm working on it." Emma chewed slowly, her eyes searching Rachel's face as if trying to gauge how serious the situation was. "I can help, you know. I could get a job after school or absolutely not." Rachel said firmly, reaching across the table to take her daughter's hand. You're 12. Your job is to do well in school and have fun, not worry about bills. Emma nodded reluctantly, but the concern never left her eyes. It was in moments like these that Rachel felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. She couldn't let Emma carry that burden. She had to be strong, for both of them. Once Emma left for school, Rachel decided she needed a break from the suffocating walls of her apartment. She grabbed her coat and walked to the nearby park, the cool autumn air brushing against her face. The leaves crunched beneath her boots as she made her way to an empty bench. From here, she could see the skyline of the city where her old life was still thriving without her. Somewhere, Daniel was probably in a meeting, commanding a room full of executives and basking in the glow of his latest triumph. The thought made her chest tighten, but she forced herself to push it aside. Dwelling on Daniel wouldn't help her now. She needed to focus on what was next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Peter. Hey, Rachel. His voice came through, warm and familiar. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. I might have something for you. Rachel's grip tightened around the phone. Really? Yeah. My cousin owns a cafe downtown. She's looking for someone to help with catering events. It's not exactly corporate-level work, but it's a start. I'll take it, Rachel said without hesitation. Peter chuckled. I figured you'd say that. I'll set up a meeting for you tomorrow. As she hung up, Rachel allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't the dream job she had once envisioned, but it was a chance. And right now, that was enough. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the cafe, a cozy corner spot with large windows and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen. She was greeted by a woman with short, curly hair and a warm smile. You must be Rachel, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Maria, the owner. Rachel shook her hand firmly. Thank you for meeting with me. They sat at a small table by the window, where sunlight streamed in, making the place feel even warmer. Maria glanced over Rachel's resume, which was thin, to say the least, but her experience running charity events and managing the household budget was noted. I like what I see, Maria said finally. You've got organizational skills, and I need someone who can think on their feet. We get a lot of last-minute orders, and I could use someone reliable. The pay isn't great, but if you're willing to work hard, there's room to grow. Rachel nodded, relief washing over her. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Great. You can start tomorrow. That evening, Rachel shared the news with Emma over dinner. The girl's face lit up with excitement, and for the first time in weeks, Rachel felt like she wasn't failing. That's amazing, Mom, Emma said, her fork clinking against her plate. Do you think you'll get to make any of your own recipes? Rachel paused, considering the idea. Her baking had always been more than a hobby. It was something that grounded her, gave her a sense of purpose. She had given it up during her marriage, but maybe this was the chance to rediscover that passion. Maybe, she said, smiling. We'll see. But as the days passed, Rachel quickly realized how demanding the job was. She spent long hours on her feet, juggling multiple tasks and learning the ins and outs of the business. She came home exhausted, often collapsing on the couch without even changing out of her work clothes. But she never complained. This was the path she had chosen, and she was determined to make it work. One night, as she was cleaning up after dinner, her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. It was brief and condescending. Heard you found a job. Hope it's enough to get by. Rachel stared at the message, her fingers trembling. It was a reminder of how much he underestimated her. But instead of replying, she deleted the message and turned off her phone. She didn't need his approval or his pity. The following week, Maria asked Rachel to help create a menu for an upcoming event, giving her the freedom to showcase some of her own recipes. She worked late into the night, perfecting each dish, and when the event was a success, Maria praised her for the effort. Ever thought about starting your own business? Maria asked casually. Rachel laughed, but the thought stuck with her. The idea of building something of her own, something no one, not even Daniel, could take away, sparked a fire in her. As she walked home that night, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs, she knew that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming her identity, her ambitions, and her future. this was just the beginning. The air inside Rachel's apartment was warm with the smell of flour and sugar, the faint hum of an oven timer breaking the stillness of the evening. On the small, cluttered kitchen counter, rows of freshly baked muffins sat cooling next to bowls of batter and a mountain of dirty dishes. The space, barely large enough for Rachel to move comfortably, was a far cry from the gleaming kitchen she used to have. But it didn't matter. She was working on something that felt bigger than the size of her surroundings. The day had been long. After a full shift at the cafe, Rachel had come home to prepare dinner for Emma, help with homework, and then dive straight into the baking she had started as a side project. Exhaustion gnawed at her, but her determination kept her on her feet. Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her socks making soft sounds against the floor. She wore an oversized hoodie and carried her math textbook, but it was the sleepy curiosity in her eyes that caught Rachel's attention. "Mom, it smells really good in here," Emma said, leaning over to sniff a muffin. "Are these for us?" Rachel chuckled softly and shook her head. "Not this time, sweetie. I've got an order to fill." Emma frowned, the disappointment on her face quickly replaced by curiosity. "An order? For who?" Rachel wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "Remember Maria's cousin? She owns that little catering business downtown. She mentioned needing baked goods for a corporate breakfast, and I offered to help." Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Wait, so this is your first order?" "Yep." Rachel smiled, though the weight of the task pressed heavily on her chest. "If it goes well, maybe there will be more." Emma clapped her hands together. "That's amazing. You're basically starting your own business." Rachel laughed. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, kiddo. Right now, it's just a side gig." Emma tilted her head. "But it could be more, right?" Rachel hesitated, the thoughts swirling around her mind. She had always loved baking. Before her marriage, she had dreamed of opening a bakery, a place filled with the smell of fresh bread and the warmth of community. But those dreams had been shelved, first by the demands of family life and later by Daniel's insistence that her little hobby wasn't worth the effort. "I guess it could," Rachel admitted, her voice soft, "but let's take it one step at a time." Emma grinned and grabbed a muffin, ignoring her mother's playful scolding. As she took a bite, her expression lit up. "You're gonna be famous, Mom. I just know it." The next morning, Rachel loaded the boxes of muffins and scones into the back seat of her car, careful not to let anything topple over. The drive to the catering venue was short, but her nerves stretched the minutes into what felt like hours. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as she rehearsed the conversation she would have with Maria's cousin. "Thank you for the opportunity. I hope everything is to your liking. I'm open to feedback." She repeated the words in her head like a mantra, trying to suppress the anxiety bubbling in her chest. When she arrived, the small catering kitchen was already buzzing with activity. Waitstaff hurried past her, balancing trays of coffee and juice, while chefs shouted orders across the room. Rachel carefully carried her boxes inside and was met by a woman with salt and pepper hair and a warm, no-nonsense demeanor. "You must be Rachel," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Carla. Heard good things about your baking from Maria." Rachel smiled nervously and set the boxes down on a nearby table. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I hope everything meets your expectations." Carla lifted the lid of one box and picked up a muffin, examining it closely before taking a bite. She chewed thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. Rachel held her breath, waiting for some sign of approval, or worse, disappointment. After what felt like an eternity, Carla nodded and smiled. "These are good. Really good. The texture's perfect, and they're not overly sweet. I think they'll go over well with the clients." Relief washed over Rachel, and she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm so glad you think so. We'll definitely be in touch for future events," Carla added, closing the box. "If you can keep up with the demand, there's room for this to grow." Rachel left the catering kitchen with a sense of accomplishment that felt foreign and exhilarating. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't just surviving. She was moving forward. Later that evening, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a calculator, crunching numbers. She had earned a modest profit from the catering order, but it was enough to cover the week's groceries and put a little extra aside. As she jotted down figures, her mind raced with possibilities. The idea of turning her baking into a full-fledged business didn't seem as impossible as it once had. If she could secure more catering orders and maybe even sell her goods at local farmers markets, she could build something sustainable. She could provide for Emma without worrying about the next bill due or the next rejection email from a job application. But doubt crept in, whispering insidious thoughts into her mind. What if this was just a fluke? What if she wasn't cut out for entrepreneurship? Daniel's voice echoed in her memory, dismissive and cold. "You're not built for this, Rachel. Stick to what you know." She pushed the thought away and focused on the present. She had made it through today, and that was enough for now. Emma joined her at the table, carrying a plate of cookies she had decorated herself. The frosting was uneven, and the sprinkles were scattered in chaotic patterns, but the sight of them made Rachel smile. "Can we try selling these too?" Emma asked, offering a cookie. Rachel took a bite and pretended to consider the idea seriously. "You know, with a little practice, you might be my business partner someday." Emma beamed, her excitement infectious. "Really? Really?" Rachel laughed and ruffled her daughter's hair. "But we'll need to work on your decorating skills." The following weekend, Rachel packed her car with trays of baked goods and set up a small stall at the local farmers market. The air was crisp, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted from nearby stands. She arranged the pastries neatly on the table, her heart pounding as she waited for her first customer. The morning started slow, but as the sun climbed higher, the foot traffic increased. A few passers-by stopped to sample her goods, and soon, word began to spread. By noon, she had sold nearly everything on the table. Peter showed up unexpectedly, grinning as he approached the stall. "Looks like business is booming," he said, gesturing to the empty trays. Rachel smiled, her cheeks flushed from the excitement and the cool breeze. "It's a good start." Peter handed her a cup of coffee and leaned against the table. "I always knew you had it in you. What's next?" Rachel stared out at the bustling market, her mind buzzing with ideas. "I don't know exactly," she admitted, "but I think I'm ready to find out." And for the first time since her world had crumbled, Rachel felt the stirring of hope. She wasn't just building a business. She was rebuilding her life, one step at a time. The brisk morning air greeted Rachel as she unloaded trays of pastries and muffins from her car outside a cozy cafe on the edge of the city's bustling downtown. The rhythmic hum of traffic filled the background as she carefully balanced the boxes and made her way through the glass doors, the small bell above tinkling to announce her arrival. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the anticipation of what this delivery meant. Business was picking up faster than she had expected. What had begun as a modest side hustle had quickly become a lifeline. Orders from local cafes and catering gigs trickled in steadily, and although her earnings weren't life-changing yet, they were enough to cover her bills and give her hope for something more permanent. As she placed the boxes on the counter, the cafe owner, a kind woman named Lila, peeked inside and grinned. "You've outdone yourself again, Rachel. Our customers have been asking for these lemon muffins nonstop." Rachel smiled, a mix of pride and relief. "I'm glad they're enjoying them. Let me know if you ever need anything different for the menu." Lila handed her an envelope with payment and leaned closer. "Actually, there's something I wanted to ask. We're hosting a weekend brunch event next month, and I'd love for you to be the main supplier. Can you handle it?" The word struck her like a bolt of energy. It was the kind of opportunity she had only dreamed about during those long nights of baking alone in her tiny kitchen. "Of course," she replied, trying to mask the excitement in her voice. "Just send me the details, and I'll make sure everything's ready." As Rachel walked back to her car, the cold air stung her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts raced with possibilities. If this event went well, it could lead to more partnerships, maybe even a permanent place on Lila's menu. But that also meant more work and more pressure. That evening, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks, recipe cards, and lists of ingredients. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the room. Emma sat across from her, scribbling in her homework notebook, but occasionally glancing up at her mother. "Mom, you've been writing for an hour. What's going on?" Emma asked, chewing on the end of her pencil. Rachel rubbed her temples and leaned back in her chair. Just planning for a big order. It's important, and I want everything to be perfect. Emma tilted her head. You're always worried about being perfect. But you haven't messed up anything yet. Rachel chuckled softly. Thanks for the vote of confidence, kiddo. But this is a big deal. If I do well, it could lead to something long-term. Then you'll definitely do well, Emma said with a grin. Because you're awesome. Rachel smiled, the warmth of her daughter's support wrapping around her like a blanket. I hope you're right. But deep down, Rachel knew that success wasn't guaranteed. She had been riding a wave of small wins, but the pressure to maintain that momentum weighed heavily on her. One slip, one failed order, and everything could come crashing down. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Rachel spent her days working at the cafe and her nights testing recipes and perfecting her menu for the upcoming brunch event. Her kitchen became a battlefield of flour, sugar, and sticky notes plastered on cabinets with reminders like don't forget extra vanilla and reduce baking time by 5 minutes. Exhaustion clawed at her, but she refused to slow down. One night, as she pulled a tray of scones from the oven, her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a text from Peter. How's the baking queen doing? Need a taste tester? She smiled and typed back. I'm drowning in scones, but thanks for the offer. Moments later, her phone rang, and Peter's familiar voice filled the room. Hey, I'm serious. I could be there in 10 minutes. Rachel laughed, wiping flour from her hands. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I'm fine. Just tired. Don't overwork yourself, Ratch. You've come so far already. His words hung in the air, a gentle reminder of how much her life had shifted in just a few months. I know, she said softly, but I can't afford to stop now. Just remember to breathe, Peter said, his tone warm and reassuring. You've got this. The morning of the brunch event arrived with the crisp smell of fresh pastries filling the air. Rachel loaded her car with trays of muffins, scones, and quiches, each item meticulously prepared and packaged. Her nerves buzzed as she drove to the cafe, but she kept reminding herself of Emma's words, "You're awesome." The cafe was already bustling when she arrived, and Lila greeted her with a hug. "Everything looks amazing," she said, peeking into one of the boxes. "I knew I could count on you." Rachel set up her station in the corner of the cafe, arranging the pastries in neat rows and adding small decorative signs for each item. As customers began filtering in, she watched anxiously from behind the counter, waiting for their reactions. The first bite was taken by a woman in a navy blazer who closed her eyes and smiled as she chewed. Then came the murmurs of approval, the polite clinks of forks against plates, and the occasional, "Where can I buy these?" The tension in Rachel's shoulders eased, and she allowed herself a small moment of pride. Halfway through the event, Lila pulled her aside. "I've had at least 5 people ask if they can order your pastries for their own events. You might need to hire some help soon." Rachel laughed, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. "I'll cross that bridge when I get there." But even as she said it, she knew that moment wasn't far off. Her small, humble beginning was starting to turn into something bigger. That evening, Rachel returned home with a heart full of hope and a mind buzzing with plans. Emma was waiting for her on the couch, a bowl of popcorn balanced on her lap and a movie paused on the TV. "How'd it go?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting up. Rachel plopped down next to her and sighed, a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Better than I expected. People actually want to place orders." Emma grinned and handed her a handful of popcorn. "Told you. You're famous now." Rachel laughed and pulled her daughter close. "Not quite, but we're getting there." As they sat together, the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like possibility. Rachel wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't depend on anyone but herself. But in the back of her mind, she knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and Daniel's presence still lingered like a shadow she couldn't fully shake. She would need to stay strong, not just for herself, but for Emma, and she was ready for whatever came next. The rain was steady that morning, tapping gently against the kitchen window as Rachel flipped through a stack of invoices at the table. The once small operation she had started from her cramped kitchen had taken on a life of its own, and now she found herself juggling more responsibilities than she'd ever anticipated. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails from suppliers, messages from customers placing last-minute orders, and a reminder about the afternoon meeting with a potential investor. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Scaling her business had always been the dream, but the speed at which it was happening had caught her off guard. Orders were coming in faster than she could manage, and her modest workspace was no longer enough. She needed a commercial kitchen, a larger team, and funding to support this growth. That's why today's meeting was so important. If the investor liked what he saw, she could secure enough money to open her first retail bakery, a real store, not just a temporary stall at farmers markets. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, holding a bowl of cereal. "You've been up since 5 a.m., haven't you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Rachel smiled, though exhaustion tugged at her features. "I had to get a head start. Big day today." Emma sat down next to her and popped a spoonful of cereal into her mouth. "Are you nervous about the meeting?" "A little," Rachel admitted, tapping the edge of her notebook. "But it's a good kind of nervous. If this goes well, we'll finally have a real bakery." Emma grinned, her excitement contagious. "Does that mean I get free cookies whenever I want?" "Absolutely," Rachel said, laughing. "But you'll have to help me bake them." "Deal." Emma leaned in and hugged her mother tightly. Rachel held on for a moment, drawing strength from her daughter's unwavering support. No matter how overwhelming things became, Emma reminded her why she was doing this. The thought of giving her daughter a stable future was enough to keep her moving forward. The meeting took place in a sleek, modern office downtown, the kind of space Rachel hadn't set foot in since her days as Daniel Weston's wife. The glass walls, high-tech conference rooms, and polished floors brought back memories of her former life. But she shook them off as she entered the building, determined to focus on the present. Peter was already waiting for her in the lobby. Dressed in a sharp suit, he gave her a reassuring smile as she approached. "You've got this, Ratch," he said, offering her a quick hug. "Just be yourself." Rachel nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like an eternity, but when the doors opened, she straightened her posture and reminded herself of how far she'd come. She wasn't the woman Daniel had left behind anymore. She was a business owner, and she had earned her place here. The investor, a middle-aged man named Andrew Morrison, greeted her with a firm handshake and invited her to sit at a large conference table. His assistant handed her a cup of coffee, and they exchanged polite pleasantries before diving into the details of her business. Rachel presented her financials, growth projections, and customer testimonials with confidence, but inside, her nerves were coiled like a spring. She could see Andrew nodding along, occasionally asking questions about her target market and scalability. By the time she finished, her palms were damp, and she clenched them under the table to steady herself. "Well," Andrew said, leaning back in his chair, "I have to say, I'm impressed. You've built this from the ground up in such a short time, and the numbers speak for themselves. I like what I'm seeing." Rachel's breath hitched, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you. I believe this business has the potential to grow even further with the right resources." Andrew smiled. "I agree. I'm prepared to offer you the funding you need, but I'd like a percentage of equity in return. We can discuss the specifics, but I think we can work something out." Rachel nodded, relief washing over her. "That sounds fair. I'm willing to negotiate." They wrapped up the meeting with a handshake, and as Rachel exited the building, the weight she had been carrying for weeks lifted slightly. She stepped onto the sidewalk, the rain still falling softly, and tilted her head toward the gray sky. This was it, the turning point she had been waiting for. Peter caught up with her, holding an umbrella over their heads. "You did it," he said, grinning. "How do you feel?" "A little overwhelmed," Rachel admitted, "but mostly excited." "You should be. This is huge, Rachel." She nodded, the reality of it sinking in. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and the future she had once thought was out of reach was now within her grasp. Over the next few months, Rachel poured herself into the expansion. She secured a lease on a storefront in a bustling part of town and transformed the space into a warm, inviting bakery. The walls were painted a soft cream color, with wooden shelves displaying jars of flour, sugar, and other ingredients as part of the decor. The smell of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air, creating a cozy atmosphere that drew people in from the street. Emma helped where she could, often spending weekends at the bakery, rolling dough and decorating cookies under her mother's supervision. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and Rachel cherished these moments, knowing they were building something together. The grand opening was a whirlwind of activity. Customers lined up outside, eager to try the pastries they had heard about from friends and social media. Rachel barely had time to catch her breath as orders flooded in, but the chaos was a welcome change from the quiet struggles of her past. By the end of the day, the bakery had sold out of nearly everything, and Rachel stood behind the counter, wiping down surfaces with a smile that wouldn't fade. Peter showed up just as she locked the doors for the night, carrying a bottle of champagne. "I figured you could use this," he said, handing it to her. Rachel laughed and accepted the bottle. "You know me too well." They sat at one of the small tables, sipping champagne and reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The dim light cast a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt at peace. "You did it," Peter said, raising his glass. "This is just the beginning." Rachel clinked her glass against his, her gaze sweeping across the bakery. "It is. But I wouldn't have made it without you and Emma." Peter smiled, his eyes softening. "You did this, Rach. You believed in yourself." As she finished her glass of champagne, Rachel allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had built something no one could take away from her, something that was hers alone. But even as she basked in her success, she knew the journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, and Daniel's shadow lingered in the background, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be. The sound of clinking glasses and gentle laughter filled the grand ballroom of a downtown luxury hotel, where the annual Small Business Owners Gala was in full swing. Waiters glided through the room, balancing trays of champagne as the city's most promising entrepreneurs mingled beneath the glittering chandeliers. Rachel stood near a marble column, her black dress hugging her frame perfectly, exuding confidence. But beneath the poised exterior, her heart raced. This was her biggest event yet. She had been invited as one of the featured business owners, a sign that her bakery wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Sweet Revival had grown into a regional sensation, with features in food magazines and partnerships with local cafes. Yet, standing here among other successful entrepreneurs, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. The shadow of her past, of Daniel, still lingered in the corners of her mind, waiting to cast its doubt on her newfound success. Peter appeared beside her, handing her a glass of champagne. "Why do you look like you're preparing for battle?" he asked with a chuckle. Rachel laughed softly, grateful for his presence. "Just nerves, I guess. This is a big night." He gave her a reassuring smile. "Relax. You belong here just as much as anyone else in this room." Rachel nodded and took a sip of champagne, the bubbles fizzing pleasantly on her tongue. But as she scanned the room, her breath hitched. Near the entrance, standing tall in a tailored suit, was Daniel Weston. His gaze swept across the room like a predator surveying his domain. When his eyes landed on her, a flicker of recognition passed between them, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Peter followed her gaze and frowned. "Is that?" "Yes," Rachel said quietly, setting her glass down on a nearby table. "That's Daniel. Do you want to leave?" "No," she straightened her shoulders and squared her jaw. "I'm not running from him." Daniel made his way across the room, his confident stride unchanged despite the turmoil Rachel knew had recently shaken his life. Rumors of his failing investments and contentious board meetings had reached her ears, but she hadn't given them much thought until now. As he stopped in front of her, the familiar smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but it no longer had the power to unnerve her. "Rachel," he said smoothly, as if their divorce had been a minor inconvenience rather than a complete dismantling of her life. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Funny," Rachel replied, her voice cool. I was just thinking the same thing about you. Peter lingered nearby, but Rachel gave him a subtle nod, signaling that she could handle this. Daniel's gaze flicked toward Peter before settling back on her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. You've done well for yourself, he said, gesturing around the room. I've heard about your bakery. Impressive growth. Rachel crossed her arms, her smile unwavering. Thank you. I've worked hard for it. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if assessing her. I suppose I underestimated you. The words were meant to sound complimentary, but Rachel detected the underlying arrogance, the belief that she had somehow surprised him by achieving something he thought was beyond her. It fueled the fire within her. Yes, you did, she said, her tone sharp. But I stopped needing your validation a long time ago. Daniel's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he regained his composure. You always were stubborn. Rachel resisted the urge to roll her eyes. No, Daniel, I'm determined. There's a difference. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a microphone crackling to life as the event's host announced the start of the awards ceremony. Rachel excused herself and made her way to the front of the room, leaving Daniel standing alone in the sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits. Later that night, after the gala had ended and the crowd had dispersed, Rachel stood on the hotel's rooftop terrace, looking out over the city's twinkling lights. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but she welcomed the chill. It helped clear her mind. Footsteps approached, and she turned to see Peter joining her, his tie loosened and his hands tucked into his pockets. I figured I'd find you up here, he said. Rachel smiled faintly and leaned against the railing. I needed a moment to breathe. You handled yourself well tonight, Peter said, leaning beside her. Especially with Daniel. Her grip on the railing tightened slightly. It wasn't easy. Seeing him again brought back a lot. Peter nodded, his gaze fixed on the skyline. You've come a long way, Rachel. Don't let him make you feel otherwise. I won't, she said firmly. But it's not just him. It's everything. The success, the growth. Sometimes it feels like I'm walking on a tightrope, and one wrong step could send everything crashing down. Peter turned to face her, his eyes filled with understanding. That's normal. But you're not the same person you were when he left. You're stronger now, and you're not doing this alone. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat and smiled. Thanks, Peter. I needed to hear that. They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments before Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. An email from Lila, one of her first clients, congratulating her on the recent press coverage of the bakery. As she put her phone away, a wave of clarity washed over her. Daniel no longer had power over her life. The woman she had become wasn't defined by the man who had once dismissed her. She had built this success brick by brick, and no amount of condescending smirks could take that away. Over the next few weeks, Rachel channeled her energy into expanding Sweet Revival even further. She signed a contract with a regional grocery chain, ensuring that her baked goods would be stocked in stores across the state. She hired a small team of employees, including a pastry chef and a marketing coordinator, allowing her to delegate tasks and focus on strategy. Her days were filled with meetings, recipe development, and overseeing production, but the long hours didn't faze her. Each milestone reminded her of why she had started this journey, to prove, not to Daniel, but to herself, that she was capable of success. But Daniel wasn't entirely gone from her life. He occasionally appeared at social events, always making subtle comments that hinted at his desire to rekindle a connection. Whether it was curiosity, regret, or something else, Rachel couldn't be sure. But she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't fall back into his orbit. One evening, after a particularly long day at the bakery, Rachel sat on the couch with Emma, watching a cooking competition on TV. Emma leaned against her, munching on popcorn and offering commentary on the contestants' dishes. Do you think you could win this show, Mom? Emma asked with a playful grin. Rachel laughed. Maybe, but I'm happy just running my own show. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I'm proud of you, you know, for everything. Rachel's heart swelled with emotion, and she pulled her daughter into a hug. I'm proud of us. We did this together. As the credits rolled and the room fell into a comfortable silence, Rachel realized that this life she had rebuilt with Emma was the real prize. The awards, the contracts, and the accolades were all secondary to the peace she felt in her heart. The turning point wasn't about proving Daniel wrong. It was about proving herself right. Daniel Weston sat in his office. The city's skyline sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a painting of power and potential. But tonight, the view felt hollow. His once vibrant empire, the corporate giant he had spent years building, was cracking beneath his feet. The glow of the city lights no longer inspired him. It mocked him. Stacks of financial reports littered his desk, each one delivering the same grim news. Failing investments, plummeting revenue, and board members growing restless. The whispers about his declining fortune had started months ago, but he had brushed them off as temporary setbacks. Now, they were undeniable. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, loosening it as he leaned back in his leather chair. The phone on his desk buzzed, but he ignored it. The calls were relentless. Lawyers, board members, creditors, all demanding answers he didn't have. In the silence, Daniel's mind drifted back to the gala where he had seen Rachel for the first time in years. She had looked radiant, confident in a way he had never seen when they were married. He had been curious at first, intrigued by her transformation. But now, as his life unraveled, her success gnawed at him. She had built something out of the ashes of their marriage, while he was watching everything he built burn to the ground. Vanessa's voice broke the silence, sharp and impatient. "Are you just going to sit there all night?" she asked, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Dressed in designer clothes and heels that clicked ominously on the floor, she looked every bit the trophy wife he had once admired. But now, her presence felt suffocating. "I'm thinking," Daniel muttered, not meeting her eyes. "You've been thinking for weeks, and nothing's changed," Vanessa snapped. "Your company is falling apart, Daniel. What are you doing about it?" He stood up abruptly, the force of his movement knocking over a coffee mug on his desk. "I don't need a lecture right now." Vanessa scoffed and walked further into the room, her heels tapping like a countdown clock. "You used to be unstoppable. What happened to that man?" Daniel clenched his fists, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "That man is still here." "Really?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Because all I see is someone drowning." The tension between them thickened until Vanessa finally turned and walked toward the door. "I can't live like this, Daniel," she said over her shoulder. "If you can't fix this mess, don't expect me to stick around." The door slammed behind her, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He collapsed back into his chair, his breath shallow and uneven. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just losing his company, he was losing everything. The following weeks were a whirlwind of desperation. Daniel met with investors, pleaded with board members, and scrambled to salvage what was left of his empire. But every solution he proposed fell apart under scrutiny. His past decisions, the risky acquisitions, the over-leveraged investments, had finally caught up with him. At home, things were no better. Vanessa had stopped pretending to care. She spent most nights out, attending parties and events, while Daniel remained confined to his office, drowning in paperwork and regret. The distance between them widened with each passing day until, one morning, he woke up to find her closet empty and a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this anymore. Don't call me." He crumpled the note in his hand, his throat tightening as the reality set in. She had left him, not that he blamed her. Vanessa had married a man at the top of his game, and now she was walking away from the ruins. It was poetic in a way. He had left Rachel for Vanessa, and now Vanessa had abandoned him when he needed her most. Desperation clawed at him, but there was only one person he could think of who might understand what he was going through. Swallowing his pride, he picked up his phone and dialed Rachel's number. Rachel was in the middle of decorating a batch of cupcakes when her phone vibrated on the counter. She wiped her hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. The name flashing across it made her pause. "Daniel?" Her first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of her. With a sigh, she answered, "Daniel." There was a brief silence on the other end before his voice came through, strained and unfamiliar. "Rachel, I need to see you." Rachel leaned against the counter, her brow furrowing. "What's this about?" "Please," he said, his tone verging on desperation. It's important. Against her better judgment, Rachel agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe. She arrived early, choosing a table near the window where she could watch the rain drizzle down the glass. When Daniel walked in, she barely recognized him. His suit was still tailored, but it hung loosely on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the confident air he once carried was nowhere to be seen. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting across from her. Rachel folded her hands on the table and studied him carefully. "What do you want, Daniel?" He exhaled, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. "Everything's falling apart. The company, my marriage, everything." Rachel tilted her head slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "And what do you expect me to do about that?" Daniel looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. "I don't know. I guess I just needed someone to talk to." The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had once discarded her without a second thought was now sitting in front of her, seeking comfort. But Rachel wasn't the same woman he had left behind. She had rebuilt her life, and she didn't owe him anything. "Daniel," she said softly, "you made your choices. You built your empire, and you tore it down with those same hands." He flinched, her words cutting deeper than he had expected. I know I messed up." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "I spent years trying to be what you wanted, and when I wasn't enough, you replaced me. I hit rock bottom, Daniel, but I climbed out. You can too. But you have to stop looking for people to save you." Silence stretched between them, the weight of her words settling like fog. Daniel stared out the window, the rain blurring the city beyond. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't something he could fix with charm or power. He had to face the consequences of his actions, just as Rachel had. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Rachel nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I don't need your apology, Daniel. I've moved on. You need to figure out how to do the same." She stood, leaving a few bills on the table to cover her coffee. As she walked toward the door, a sense of closure washed over her. The chapter of her life that had once revolved around Daniel was finally over. Daniel remained at the table, watching her leave through the rain-streaked glass. He had thought that reaching out to her would bring him some sense of peace, but instead, it left him with the realization that she had grown beyond him, and he was still stuck in the wreckage of his past. For the first time, Daniel Weston understood what it meant to lose. The bakery doors swung open, letting in a gust of crisp morning air as the bell above jingled softly. Rachel stood behind the counter, her hands dusted with flour, carefully arranging a tray of freshly baked croissants. The scent of buttery pastries and brewing coffee filled the room, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Customers filtered in, their chatter blending harmoniously with the soft jazz playing in the background. It had been 6 months since the grand opening of Sweet Revival, and every morning brought a new reminder of how far she had come. What had once been a dream buried beneath the weight of a failed marriage was now a thriving business, rooted in resilience and purpose. The front door opened again, and Emma strolled in. Her school backpack slung over one shoulder and a mischievous grin on her face. She walked behind the counter and popped a piece of warm bread into her mouth before Rachel could stop her. "Emma," Rachel scolded, though she couldn't help but laugh. "You're supposed to be on your way to school." "I have time," Emma replied, still chewing. "Besides, I needed breakfast." Rachel shook her head and handed her a paper bag with a muffin inside. "Here, don't be late." Emma grinned and leaned in to kiss her mother on the cheek. "You're the best." As Emma dashed out the door, Rachel watched her disappear down the street. The sight filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Her daughter was happy, her business was thriving, and for once, Rachel wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. The morning rush continued, with regular customers greeting Rachel by name and new ones marveling at the bakery's cozy charm. By mid-morning, the line had finally thinned, giving her a moment to breathe. She wiped her hands on her apron and poured herself a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth as she gazed out the window at the bustling street beyond. Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Peter. "Dinner tonight? I have something to celebrate." Rachel smiled and quickly typed back, Sure. I'll meet you at 7. Peter had been her rock through it all, offering encouragement when she doubted herself and reminding her of her worth when the shadows of her past tried to creep back in. Their friendship had grown into something deeper, though they had taken things slow, careful not to rush into anything before they were ready. Tonight felt different, though, like a turning point. That evening, Rachel stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the soft curls in her hair and smoothing the fabric of her dress. She opted for something simple yet elegant, a deep burgundy dress that hugged her in all the right places without being flashy. As she applied a final touch of lipstick, she caught her reflection and paused. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same Rachel who had once been broken and lost. This Rachel was confident, determined, and finally free from the weight of other people's expectations. She smiled at herself, a small but significant victory. When she arrived at the restaurant, Peter was already waiting at a candlelit table near the window. He stood as she approached, his eyes lighting up in a way that made her heart flutter. "You look amazing," he said, pulling out her chair. "Thank you," Rachel replied, feeling the warmth of his compliment. As they settled in, Peter raised his glass of wine. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice filled with meaning. Rachel clinked her glass against his. "To new beginnings." Over dinner, they talked about everything from the bakery's recent success to Emma's latest school project. But beneath the surface, Rachel sensed that Peter had something else on his mind. She didn't press him, knowing he would tell her when he was ready. After dessert, he reached across the table and took her hand. "I've watched you grow into someone incredible, Rachel," he said, his tone serious. "I know how hard this journey has been for you, and I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. But I also know there's still room for more, for happiness, for love." Rachel's breath hitched, and she squeezed his hand gently. "I know," she whispered. Peter smiled, his thumb tracing small circles on her hand. "I want to be part of that journey with you, not just as a friend, but as someone who stands by you through everything." Emotion swelled in her chest, and for a moment, she struggled to find the words. "I want that too," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. Peter leaned in, their foreheads touching briefly, and in that moment, Rachel felt the weight of her past fully lift. She wasn't defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she had built and what she was ready to embrace. The weeks that followed were filled with change and growth. Peter became a more permanent presence in Rachel's life, seamlessly fitting into her world without overshadowing it. They shared quiet mornings at the bakery, late-night talks over cups of tea, and weekends filled with laughter and adventure. But the biggest surprise came on an otherwise ordinary afternoon when Rachel realized she was late. Late in a way that made her heart race. She bought a test on her way home, her hands trembling as she waited for the result. When the positive line appeared, tears filled her eyes. Emma was the first to know. Rachel sat her down in the living room, her voice shaking slightly as she shared the news. To her relief, Emma's face lit up with excitement. "I'm going to be a big sister?" she asked, practically bouncing in her seat. "Yes," Rachel said, laughing through her tears. "You're going to be amazing." Emma hugged her tightly, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like her family was whole. When Rachel told Peter, his reaction mirrored Emma's, pure joy mixed with a touch of disbelief. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her forehead, whispering, "We're going to be great parents." The months that followed were a blur of preparations, but amidst the chaos, Rachel found peace. She continued to run the bakery, delegating more tasks to her growing team, and spent her evenings preparing for the baby's arrival. One sunny afternoon, as she stood in the nursery arranging tiny clothes in a dresser, Peter walked in with a cup of tea. He placed it on the nightstand and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" he asked softly. Rachel leaned into him, her hands resting on his. "All the time, and I wouldn't change any of it." He kissed her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "Neither would I." The day their baby was born, the world seemed to stand still. Rachel held the tiny bundle in her arms, her heart swelling with a love she hadn't known was possible. Emma sat beside her, marveling at her new sibling, while Peter stood nearby, tears glistening in his eyes. As Rachel looked around the room, she realized that this was the life she had fought for. A life filled with love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. She had taken the pain of her past and turned it into something beautiful. And as Peter sat down next to her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, Rachel whispered the words she had once doubted she'd ever believe again. We made it. Indeed, they had.